Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Lindsey Piegza with us now, chief economist at Stifel as well. The world changed on Friday. It was something, Lindsey, to sit on the lawn at Jackson Hole and realize this was a speech. Was this the Powell speech of his career?
Well, it certainly did signal that Chair Powell is on the same page with the market, that, quote, the time has come to adjust policy. Although he did say that the direction of travel is still uncertain, and he left the door open in terms of the timing and the pace of rate cuts, suggesting that the Fed is still data dependent, but he wanted to make sure that investors and market participants were very clear that the Fed is on board. The time has come for rate cuts.
Lindsey, the last paragraph I thought was elegiac. I was looking for him to try to define Fed independence. Quote, "We will be open to criticism and new ideas while preserving the strengths of our framework. The limits of our knowledge, so clearly evident during the pandemic, demand humility, like we get from Lindsey Piegza at Stifel, and a questioning spirit focused on learning lessons from the past," etc., etc. It's my Yul Brynner imitation. Lindsey, what are the lessons from the past that Chairman Powell learned?
Well, I think this was a big mea culpa in the sense that, look, they were holding on to crisis level accommodation well beyond what was appropriate. They continued to wear the transitory T-shirt for much longer than was necessary. And they've realized now that that was a policy mistake, that was an error coming into this cycle. And they allowed, in many ways, price pressures to become more ingrained than they otherwise would have had they taken their foot off of the gas sooner. And so I think that's a recognition of the Fed contributing to the inflationary problems that we continue to see today, and their willingness to say, we're going to do our best to try to not make a second policy error on the back end.
So, Lindsey, from your perspective, is the Fed now pivoting to easing from a position of strength, i.e. the economy's okay, or a position of weakness, which is maybe they're too late here?
Money question.
No, I think right now the economy is still in very solid conditions, and Chairman Powell all but said so within the details of that speech, suggesting that price stability has not yet been achieved. He's increasingly confident, but prices are still high. And at the same time, the labor market, while beginning to show signs of cooling, is still overall solid. So I think right now, when we look at the consumer, when we look at the momentum in the underlying economy picking up from Q1 to Q2, not to mention, again, against the backdrop of still elevated inflation, the Fed still has a good amount of leeway to continue to move at a very slow, tempered pace, keep us in a relatively firm period, a restrictive period of policy. Remember, even after the Fed cuts rates for the first time, the Fed is in no rush back to neutral, let alone below neutral. So even after they initiate that first round reduction, it's likely that the Fed disappoints the market's expectations for a quick reversal to neutral and then back to an accommodative stance.
That's kind of where I wanted to go.
The economy is still on. I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to go, Lindsey, because it's been a while since we've all been in a rate cutting cycle. How should we expect this to go? Should it be 25 basis points every meeting, every other meeting, front load 50? How do you think they're going to proceed?
Well, I think 50 is off the table. And in fact, I never thought 50 was on the table. I think even during the July press conference, Chair Powell pushed pretty aggressively against the notion of 50 basis points, saying that's not even something we're considering at this point. So I do think 25 basis points in terms of each move is the baseline. The timing, however, I think is going to be, again, extended beyond the market's expectation. The market is looking for every meeting. I think the Fed goes at most once a quarter. Again, there's no rush for the Fed to remove policy firming at this point. The Fed is simply responding to an economy that's normalizing, not an economy that's weakening.
And full disclosure, folks, Jackson Hole's changed. It's now a bunch of academics, which is great. It's a wonderful group of people. But I liked it when people like Lindsey Piegza were there, Jan Hatzius and others. I like Diane Swank was there, Paul as well. Dr. Piegza, I heard the Stifel argument from Adam Posen and also a guy named Philip Lane with a modest job for Lagarde at the ECB, in that they said, okay, disinflation in order, but that was a Lindsey Piegza Bible, is the but coming down. How do we monitor inflation to discover that we're not disinflating like the soft landing crew hope?
Well, I think it's going to remain a data-dependent focus. Powell identified this inflationary issue as a global phenomenon. He talked about a rapid rise in the demand for goods, supply chain strained, tight labor markets, a sharp hike in commodity prices. What's interesting about that list is a number of those factors are outside of the Fed's purview. And so if we did see international tensions, geopolitical issues lead to a reversal in some of the improvement that we've seen, that could quickly undermine a good portion of this disinflation without the Fed having any control over that reversal. And so again, I think this is a very complicated pathway for inflation. Yes, we've seen a lot of improvement, but the Fed must remain vigilant in maintaining focus on that disinflationary trend because it's still very bumpy and uneven.
Lindsey, thank you so much. Lindsey Piegza at Stifel this morning here on the Powell speech, its ramifications for... Our honor to go to Israel, and Ethan Bronner, our Israel bureau chief, barely describes his knowledge, his effort, his reporting over decades in the greater Levant. Ethan, let me just get to US 101. What is the distinction between Hezbollah and Hamas?
Oh, well, good morning, Tom. I mean, there's an enormous distinction. Hezbollah is a Shiite Lebanese group on the northern border and the southern part of Lebanon, and it's the controlling force in Lebanon politically and militarily right now. And Hamas is a Sunni Palestinian group based essentially in Gaza, south of Israel.
Is Israel, from a military standpoint, do they approach this like a war, like military, like divisions and platoons, or is it a different approach to the border with Hezbollah?
So I would say that they it's been a difficult transition for the Israeli military. It faced states, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and so forth in the past. And in facing these militias, I think it's finding it more difficult to know how to handle it. I mean, it has an enormous technological advantage, obviously, but it turns out a lot of the low-tech stuff that Hezbollah and Hamas have done using drones that you can buy at Best Buy and building tunnels have really caused quite a lot of problems for the country. So I think that it's a mix. I mean, the truth is that Hamas, Nukhba force, and the Hezbollah, also militia force, are set up in divisions and in brigades, but it's really a much more of an asymmetrical warfare problem for the country.
So, Ethan, how challenging is it for the Israeli Defense Forces to have what now appears to be a two-front active war here?
Oh, it's very challenging, Paul, and it's more than two fronts, right? You have Hezbollah in the north, you have Hamas to the south, you have the Houthis further to the south, and you have militias in Iraq and Syria. All of these things, of course, are funded and sponsored by Iran way to its east. And so it likes to think of it, or it not so much likes to, but it tends to think of it as a seven-front war because there's also concern about the West Bank and some Israeli Arabs who may not be thrilled about the place. So it's very, very complex situation for the country.
Was it surprising, Ethan, that the Israelis chose to bomb Lebanon, I guess, preemptively to thwart potential attack?
I mean, these things are surprising to you and me because we're not sitting in those intelligence rooms. But what they said that they had very precise intelligence that, we've known for several weeks that since the late July killing of a militia leader in Beirut, that Hezbollah was going to respond. And at the beginning of this last week, there was a clear sense that it was coming up this week, and there was a lot of chatter about it. And then it became clear that Israel had very precise intelligence that all of these launchers were headed toward mostly northern Israel, but they included a plan to hit Lilot, which is where the intelligence community sits just outside of Tel Aviv, and they decided that they couldn't allow that to happen.
Ethan, you're such a pro on this. When I look at Israeli media, all the different Israeli Post and all the rest of it, my head spins. I can't keep track of who represents who's on the team, etc. Does Mr. Netanyahu have the support of elites in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? Does he have the support of the newspapers?
No, he does not. In many ways, Netanyahu, it's best to think of Netanyahu the way you might think of Donald Trump. Okay, that is to say, with a fair amount of popular support and utter rejection by the cultural, economic, and military elites of the country. But, the people count for a lot. And he has also done pretty well in terms of his numbers and his polling in the last 4 or 5 months. He's back up. He's not totally up, but he is steady with whoever might compete against him, and it wouldn't shock me if he were to call an election in a few months and win.
That's right where I wanted to go. I mean, now he calls an election, and do you look at him, within a democracy, a parliamentary structure, do you look at Mr. Netanyahu is basically with an extended term, an extended view, an extended vision?
Yes, I think it's very likely. I mean, look, I don't know if he'll win, but he has a decent shot at it. It's a similar question about Donald Trump right now, right? It's close, but he could. And he certainly has climbed back up because the further away we are from October 7th, the less people blame him and remember it as a failure of his part or his government, and the more his militant strength grows. And people really aren't, especially after October 7th, Israelis don't have a sense of how to handle the situation except by being tough. I mean, there's plenty to say about that question, but that is the growing sentiment here.
Ethan, you're based in Tel Aviv. I'm fascinated to understand what it's like in Tel Aviv these days. I mean, if I were to walk the streets of Tel Aviv on a Saturday evening, what would I find in the restaurants, the cafes, just on the street?
You'd find it very hard to get a table, Paul, I can tell you that. It is very, very crowded. It is still a fairly wealthy place. Lots and lots of young people. I happen to live in the southern part in the kind of cool area. I'm not so cool, but they've let me in. And it is really, really crowded. So as far as you'd be in Barcelona, that kind of equivalent. There's no sense of menace on the streets of Tel Aviv right now.
Ethan, thank you. Ethan Bronner, day after day, there's
always
leadership
good to talk.
In the Levant, the Israeli bureau chief for Bloomberg News, acclaimed for his work over the last number of decades. There are things back before digital that you would carry around to be cool. Very important. You'd carry around what was called the Maroon Book from DLJ, Donaldson Lufkin. Jen read it. Was her beautiful fixed income essay. They had some young Turk named John writing. They would write for it, I think. Or Bear Stearns had some things.
Sure.
But the mother of all status symbols was to carry around the black books of Sanford Bernstein. There were any number of iconic names there. Good morning, Brad Hintz. But one of them was a guy named Pierre Ferragu. Not that familiar, I think, to Americans, but Pierre Ferragu was an absolute required read on global technology. We're thrilled he could join us right now on Nvidia, but on tech in general. Is Nvidia, Pierre, alone, or can we take signals from Nvidia across your larger technology space?
Hey, Tom, that's a great question. Well, Nvidia is definitely not alone. A lot of people supply Nvidia, and even more people depend on Nvidia for what they're doing. But Nvidia has this particularity of being almost last to speak in earnings season. So we know a lot of what's going on in the upstream of Nvidia, in the downstream of Nvidia before they report. So you don't have that much read across coming from them, and it's just because they speak last. So what we've heard so far is that the clients of Nvidia are increasing their capex very significantly. It's good for Nvidia. And then the supply chain of Nvidia is accelerating the pace at which they make more capacity available for Nvidia, which means that we are still, based on all what we see, in a world in which there are people want to buy more GPUs than the number of GPUs that can be actually manufactured.
Pierre, do we know yet, when we look across the tech stack and we see the capital spending numbers, which are just extraordinary, how much of that is incremental for AI versus maybe shifting it from other parts of the CapEx budget, whether it's IT or something else?
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. It's usually one of the most trickiest questions you can ask when you have a technology transition. But here, the answer is actually relatively easy. Spending on AI chips might, reach like 150 billions in 2025 next year. And compared to that, the market for CPUs, which is really like the leading chip of what I would call like the traditional infrastructure, the legacy infrastructure, is only in the 20s. It's less than 30 billions. So the market for AI infrastructure is so large that you can't talk about a shift or anything else.
Right.
So that's one first way to look at it. And the second way to look at it is we haven't seen more than a slightly sluggish market outside of AI. And when you ask Microsoft, Google, and others, why are you not spending so much on CPUs and others and traditional servers? They never tell you it's because we're done with these technologies. They're telling you it's just that we don't have time. We're so focused on putting out AI that we don't have time. We'll have to catch up at some point.
Pierre, any conversation with you, we've got to look at your brilliant call on Apple with a neutral. There are 41 buys, 17 neutrals holds on Apple right now. What would it take for Apple to do to get Pierre Ferragu to go long Apple, to go buy Apple?
Well, you would need to create, in some ways, way more controversy than what you have on the stock today. Apple is a very easy story. It's a very, very high quality franchise, probably the highest quality consumer franchise in the world. They're still on top of their game. And they're very good at defending their position, mostly as, a provider of the actual hardware, like the handset, and also building out from their 1 billion user base, a steadily growing and very stable recurring revenue stream for services. And, we're going through multiple revolutions like streaming content and then voice interaction. Now we're going into artificial intelligence, and Apple is doing a very good job at adapting to all these things. But the earnings power of Apple is very, very mature. So, the controversy, is it going to grow 5% or 7% next year? And so it's very difficult to have a strong conviction on the stock as long as you don't have more of a controversy. So, a simple answer would be for people to start worry about something for Apple I would not worry about, and then probably I would become a buyer.
Mm-hmm. Pierre, is there a reasonable, I guess there's a call out there that maybe Apple has missed, at least temporarily, the AI evolution. Is that a fair statement?
Well, from a technological standpoint, I would say, Apple Intelligence, the way Apple is articulating AI for their devices, I think is very sound and very good, and it's the right way to do it. But our view here is that Apple has to host AI and let AI mature and let AI, winning use cases emerge And so it's going to be very non-disruptive to Apple. The business model of Apple is not going to change as we go through AI, even if Apple is probably going to be a major player in the adoption of AI.
Very quickly here, Pierre, you've got a humongous call on Microsoft. It was made some time ago. Do you reiterate a 570 target on Microsoft? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think Microsoft is in a very good place. Investors have been worried about Microsoft spending so much money on capex, so the free cash flow is coming down. And Tom, you know my history with TSMC. What I know a lot, and you know also my history with Tesla. I like a lot good businesses that are spending a lot of money on infrastructure, on PPEs, because if you have a good business, you make a good return on asset, and when you invest a lot, that means good returns are coming through. And so that's really the way I'm looking at Microsoft today. I'm thinking the business case of AI for them is very straightforward. It's like it's very easy to sell AI as an add-on. So they are going to make money out of all the investments they're doing today. Well, this is very, very bullish.
Never enough time. Pierre Ferragu, thank you so much. On Nvidia, on Apple, on Microsoft. Your daily look at the front page is the John Tucker Hour. Mr. Tucker.
All right, let's take a deeper dive. Bloomberg Quick Take has a deeper dive into this story that we've been reporting all morning long. As we learned of the arrest of the CEO in Europe, comes the question of how did the messaging app Telegram become a focus of extremist activity online? The service was started back in 2013, and it is actually one of the most downloaded apps worldwide. It also polices content with what you could call a pretty light touch. It's used by hundreds of millions of people across the world as a straightforward, everyday communication tool. Users can also post stories, create discussion groups, or establish what are known as channels, and a channel can end up drawing millions of subscribers. Now, Telegram was used to foment and coordinate those anti-immigrant riots in the UK last month. Well, earlier this month, I should say. Law enforcement agencies, they do actually have more leverage to persuade Facebook and Meta to help them identify users engaged in illegal activities, as it's a publicly listed company and it's headquartered in the U.S. This has proven to be largely powerless when it comes to Telegram, which is based in Dubai.
It was fermenting overnight with a huge Russian response, and the French seem pretty entrenched on it. It's just this is the way it is. What else do you have next?
All right, this is from the New York Times. Apple rethinking its movie strategy. When Apple won a bidding war in 2021 for the rights to make the action comedy Wolves with George Clooney and Brad Pitt, it did so in part because it promised the stars they'd put the movie into a large number of theaters. But this month, just 6 weeks before the film was set to show up in thousands of theaters across the country, Apple announced a significant change in plans. Wolves will now be shown on a limited number of movie screens for 1 week before becoming available on the company's streaming service.
Let's stop here. This is really important, Paul. I looked at a pie chart this weekend of market share. Who's kidding who?
Yep.
These people, this is a fantasy. Variety Magazine's done a great job on this. This is a fantasy of micro share. The fact is Paramount, Apple, all the rest have micro share. It's delusional.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and in this particular story, Tom, I mean, you get two heavyweights, George Clooney and Brad Pitt. You make a deal with these people. I can't imagine what that meeting was like to say, guys, we're going back.
They are not too happy. And they should follow my advice, Brad. Read the fine print.
Exactly. I mean, it was, Apple can do obviously whatever Apple wants, but boy, if you're George Clooney and Brad Pitt, I mean, you have to be. Right. You want that. You came up in the world where you had the broad theatrical release. So.
You know, in honor of the courage of what they did in World War II, we watched the World War II flyers thing on Apple. Spielberg did it with Tom Hanks. It was great, but it's dad garbage. You know, it's like it got next to nobody watched it. I mean, I've never seen an industry where nobody cares if anybody's watching.
I mean, there's Matt Damon and there's another movie out on one of these streaming services that back in the day would have been out in the theaters. Huge promotion, huge budget, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on every talk show. It comes out with just a whimper. But I guess if I'm Matt Damon, they wrote me my $10 million check. I spent 3 months on this thing. I don't know. I guess that's the new world.
It's the new reality.
Yes, it is.
You have to adjust.
Do you have one more, sir?
Well, let's take this one. I love this one. From the Financial Times. IKEA is taking on eBay.
Oh, boy.
IKEA is starting a peer-to-peer marketplace for consumers to sell secondhand furniture to each other. This is IKEA pre-owned. Will be tested in Madrid and Oslo until the end of the year with the aim of rolling out the buying and selling platform globally. The new marketplace, part of a transformation of IKEA over the past few years. So this is the couch
with pizza and...
The couch with Swedish meatball stains.
Yeah.
You can get some other fool to buy it from you. So.
All right. I mean, but who's ever put together an IKEA piece of furniture? I have not done that, but I know that's a.
I have so many Allen wrenches left over from that. It's like a whole collection.
I do have a collection of Allen wrenches. I full disclosure, folks, I've never been in an IKEA.
No, sir. No surprise there.
Don't know what you're missing.
John Tucker, thank you there for the news there. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.